I stood in the freezing rain outside Miller's Grill holding a crumpled termination letter in my shaking hands, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is how my story ends. My name is Ethan Cole. I was 27 years old, and I had just lost the only job that kept me from living on the streets. 5 years of double shifts, fake smiles, and aching feet, gone in a 30-second conversation. I want to tell you something most people won't admit. When you hit rock bottom, you don't just lose money, you lose yourself. You start believing the voice in your head that whispers, "You're not good enough. You never were." For months, I lived in that darkness. I sold my furniture to pay rent. I skipped meals so I could afford the bus fare to job interviews that led nowhere. I became invisible, just another face in the crowd, another failure nobody notices. But here's what they don't tell you about the bottom. Sometimes that's exactly where you need to be to find out who you really are. Because 2 years later, the man who fired me walked into my restaurant, the one with lines out the door every single night, and he couldn't even afford to eat there. This is the story of how I went from serving tables to owning them, how I turned rejection into resurrection, how the worst day of my life became the first day of my real life. And if you've ever felt like giving up, if you've ever wondered whether you have what it takes to rise again, this story is for you. Because the road to rise doesn't start when everything's perfect. It starts when you're broken, desperate, and out of options. And you choose to take one more step anyway. It was January in Nashville, and the cold wasn't just outside. It was inside me, too. I remember that morning like it was yesterday. I woke up at 5:30 like I always did, threw on my white shirt and black pants, and caught the early bus to Miller's Grill. The restaurant sat on the corner of 5th and Broadway, a place where locals came for breakfast and tourists stumbled in after too many drinks on Honky Tonk Row. I had worked there for almost 5 years. 5 years of carrying trays, memorizing orders, dealing with difficult customers who snapped their fingers at me like I was invisible. But I never complained. I needed that job. It paid $8.50 an hour plus tips, and on good nights I walked out with maybe $70 in my pocket. That morning, though, something felt different. Mr. Davis, the manager, called me into the kitchen before we opened. He was a big guy with a permanent scowl, the kind of man who made you feel small just by looking at you. He stood by the walk-in freezer with his arms crossed, and I knew right then that something was wrong. "Ethan, we need to talk," he said, not even looking me in the eye. My stomach dropped. "We're cutting staff. Sales have been down for 3 months straight, and corporate's breathing down my neck. I'm sorry, but we're letting you go." I stood there, frozen. My mind went blank. All I could manage was, "When?" "Today. Right now." He handed me an envelope with my final paycheck, $218 for 2 weeks of work. That was it. No thank you. No acknowledgement of the birthday shifts I covered, the Christmas mornings I opened, the countless times I stayed late to help close when other servers called in sick. I untied my apron, left it on the stainless steel counter, and walked out the back door into the freezing January air. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just walked. For hours I walked through downtown Nashville, past the neon lights and the music pouring out of every bar. Tourists laughed and danced, oblivious to the fact that my entire world had just collapsed. I felt like a ghost moving through their celebration. By the time I got back to my apartment, it was dark. The place was a studio, 400 square feet of peeling paint and a bathroom where the shower barely worked. The landlord had already slipped an eviction warning under the door 2 weeks earlier. I was 3 days away from being out on the street. I sat on the floor because I had already sold my couch to pay last month's electric bill. The apartment was cold. The heater hadn't worked in weeks, and I couldn't afford to get it fixed. I pulled a blanket around my shoulders and stared at the ceiling, watching my breath turn to fog in the dim light. That night I opened my fridge. Inside, a bottle of ketchup, half a loaf of bread, and a bag of rice I had been rationing for days. I made myself a ketchup sandwich and ate it sitting on the kitchen floor. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about losing a job. This was about losing my dignity, my hope, my belief that hard work actually meant something. I thought about my mom, who raised me by herself after my dad left when I was 6. She worked 2 jobs her entire life and still died with nothing in the bank. I thought about all the times she told me, "Ethan, you're gonna do something special. I know it." But sitting there in that freezing apartment, eating a ketchup sandwich in the dark, I didn't feel special. I felt like a failure. The next few days were a blur. I applied to every restaurant, every retail store, every warehouse within a 10-mile radius. I stood in line at temp agencies. I filled out online applications until my fingers went numb. And every single time, the answer was the same. "We'll keep your resume on file." Which meant no. I started selling everything I owned. My TV went for $40, my microwave for $15. I even sold my winter coat to a guy at a bus stop for $20, and then shivered through the rest of January in a hoodie 2 sizes too small. One night, I sat in the dark with my phone in my hand, scrolling through social media. Everyone I went to high school with was posting pictures of their lives, new cars, promotions, engagement rings, vacations. And there I was, 27 years old, unemployed, and 3 days from homelessness. I turned off my phone and stared at the wall, and I let myself think the thing I had been avoiding for weeks. Maybe I'm just not meant to make it. I wish I could tell you that I snapped out of it right then. That some motivational speech popped into my head and I jumped up ready to conquer the world. But that's not how it works. The truth is, I stayed on that floor for a long time, and I cried. Not the kind of crying you do at a sad movie. The kind that comes from somewhere deep inside. The kind that shakes your whole body because you finally stop pretending everything's okay. I cried because I was scared. I cried because I was alone. And I cried because for the first time in my life, I didn't know if I had the strength to get back up. I wish I could say things got better quickly. They didn't. For the next 2 months, I lived in survival mode. I took whatever work I could find, dishwashing gigs that paid under the table, handing out flyers on street corners for $10 an hour, loading trucks at a warehouse at 4 in the morning. None of it was stable. None of it was enough. I moved out of my apartment the day before the sheriff was scheduled to evict me. I didn't have anywhere to go, so I crashed on the couch of a guy I barely knew from the restaurant. His name was Marcus, and he let me stay for 2 weeks before his girlfriend put her foot down. After that, I bounced around, a different couch every few nights. Sometimes I slept in my car, a beat-up Honda Civic with a broken heater and a back seat that smelled like old French fries. On the coldest nights, I'd park under a streetlight near a 24-hour diner and try to sleep sitting up, my breath fogging the windows. I stopped answering calls from the few friends I had left. I was embarrassed, ashamed. I didn't want anyone to see me like this. One morning, I woke up in my car with frost on the inside of the windshield. My back ached. My stomach was empty. And I realized I hadn't showered in 3 days. I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. Hollow eyes, greasy hair, a face I barely recognized. "What happened to you, Ethan?" I whispered to my own reflection. I didn't have an answer. That week, I signed up for a delivery app, one of those gig economy jobs where you pick up food orders and drop them off at people's doors. It wasn't much, but it was something. The app pinged my phone at random hours, and I'd jump in my car and drive across town for $7 payouts, hoping for tips that rarely came. Most of the time, people didn't even look at me. I was just a hand holding a bag, invisible again. But one afternoon, everything changed. I got an order from a place called Eddie's Corner Grill, a small burger joint on the east side of town. The kind of spot that's been there forever, with a faded sign and red vinyl booths inside. I walked in, and the smell hit me immediately. Sizzling beef, fried onions, toasted buns. It was the kind of smell that brought back memories. Behind the counter was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with gray hair and hands that looked like they'd been working for decades. He glanced up at me and smiled. "You here for the pickup?" he asked. "Yeah." "Order for Davis." He nodded and went back to the grill, flipping burgers with the kind of rhythm that only comes from years of practice. I stood there, watching him work, and for some reason I couldn't look away. "You hungry, son?" he asked without turning around. I hesitated. "I'm good. Just here for the order." He turned and looked at me, really looked at me, not the way most people did, like I was just part of the background. He saw me. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked. I opened my mouth to lie, but the words didn't come. "Sit down," he said, nodding toward a stool at the counter. Food'll be ready in a minute. Before I could protest, he slid a plate in front of me. A cheeseburger, perfectly grilled, with a side of crispy fries. My stomach growled so loud I was sure he heard it. "On the house," he said. "Eat." I didn't argue. I picked up that burger and took a bite, and I swear to God it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. Not because it was fancy, it wasn't, but because someone cared enough to give it to me. As I ate, the old man leaned against the counter and wiped down the grill. "You look like you've been through it," he said. I nodded, swallowing a bite. "Lost my job a couple months ago. Been doing delivery stuff to get by." "What did you do before?" "I was a waiter. 5 years at Miller's Grill." He raised his eyebrows. "Miller's? I know that place. Good spot. Why'd they let you go?" "Said they were cutting staff. Wasn't my choice." He nodded slowly, like he understood more than I was saying. "You ever think about doing something of your own?" he asked. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the idea seemed impossible. "With what?" "I don't have money. I don't have a place to live. I don't have anything." He looked at me for a long moment, then said something I'll never forget. "When I started this place, I was sleeping in the back storage room. Had $50 to my name and a dream that nobody believed in. Took me 10 years to turn a profit. But you know what kept me going?" I shook my head. I stopped waiting for someone to give me permission to be something. I just started. He handed me the delivery order and patted my shoulder. "Don't give up, kid. You've got more in you than you think." I left that restaurant with a full stomach and something I hadn't felt in months: hope. That night, I sat in my car under a streetlight and pulled out an old notebook I'd been carrying around since high school. I hadn't written in it in years, but that night I started scribbling. Ideas, recipes, flavor combinations, things I'd learned from working in kitchens, things I'd always wanted to try but never had the guts to attempt. I wrote until my hand cramped, and for the first time since I got fired, I felt something other than fear. I felt possibility. I didn't know it then, but that cheeseburger, that one small act of kindness from a stranger, was the spark that would change everything. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you when you've stopped believing in yourself. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my car with that notebook open on my lap, writing by the light of my phone. Ideas poured out of me like water breaking through a dam. Sandwich combinations, sauce recipes, names for dishes. I wrote until my battery hit 5%, and then I kept writing in the dark, my handwriting getting messier with every line. By the time the sun came up, I had filled 12 pages. And I had made a decision. I was going to cook. Not for a boss. Not for tips. Not to survive someone else's kitchen rules. I was going to cook my own food, my own way, and see if anyone cared. The problem was simple. I had no money. My bank account had $32 in it. My car was running on fumes, and I was still sleeping wherever I could find a place to crash. But I also had something I didn't have a week ago, a reason to keep going. I spent the next few days doing research. I went to the library and used their computers to look up food truck permits, health codes, startup costs. Everything I read told me the same thing. You need at least $10,000 to start a legitimate food business. I had 32. So I did what desperate people do. I got creative. I went to a thrift store and bought a used cooler for $8. I went to a dollar store and picked up aluminum foil, plastic gloves, and sandwich bags. I used the last of my money to buy ground beef, buns, cheese, onions, and a few basic spices from a discount grocery store. That Saturday morning, I set up on a corner downtown near the farmer's market. I didn't have a permit. I didn't have a sign. I just had a small folding table, my cooler, and a portable grill I borrowed from Marcus. I made 10 cheeseburgers, and I waited. The first hour, nobody stopped. People walked past me like I wasn't there. A couple of folks glanced over, but kept moving. I stood there in the cold, flipping burgers on that tiny grill, wondering if I'd made a huge mistake. Then a guy in a construction vest walked up. "How much?" he asked, nodding at the burgers. I hadn't even thought about pricing. $5, I said, making it up on the spot. He pulled out a crumpled bill, and I handed him a burger wrapped in foil. He took a bite, chewed, and then stopped. He looked at me. "Damn, man, this is good." "Thanks," I said. trying not to smile too big. He finished the whole thing in 4 bites, wiped his mouth and said, "I'll take another one." By noon I had sold all 10 burgers, $50 in 3 hours. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The next week I did it again. This time, I made 20 burgers. Sold out by 1 o'clock. I started showing up every Saturday and Sunday. Same corner, same setup. Word started to spread, not because I advertised, but because people told their friends. "There's this guy with a grill downtown. Best burger you'll ever have for $5. I wasn't just cooking, I was connecting. Every customer, I looked them in the eye. I asked how their day was going. I remembered their names. I made them feel like they mattered. Because I knew what it felt like to be invisible. One Sunday afternoon, a kid, maybe 16 or 17, stopped by my table. He had his phone out filming. "Yo, can I get one of those burgers?" he asked. "Absolutely," I said, handing him one fresh off the grill. He took a bite on camera, and his eyes went wide. "Bro, this is fire," he said, still recording. "Where's your restaurant?" I laughed. "This is it, man, just me and a grill." He posted the video that night. By Monday morning, it had 15,000 views. By Wednesday, it had hit 100,000. People started showing up looking for that burger guy. I went from making 20 burgers a weekend to making 50, then 100. I couldn't keep up. I was still sleeping in my car, still showering at a gym I paid $10 a month for. But now, I had cash coming in. Not a lot, but enough to start thinking bigger. I saved every dollar. I ate the cheapest food I could find. I didn't buy new clothes. I didn't go out. I lived like a monk with one goal: save enough to take the next step. 3 months later, I had $2,800. I bought a used food truck. It was a beat-up old thing, dented, rusted, with a broken AC and a grill that barely worked. But it was mine. I painted over the old logo with cheap white paint and hand-lettered the name across the side in black marker, Cole's Corner. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. I parked that truck on the same corner where I'd started with my folding table, and I opened for business. The line stretched down the block. People came because they'd seen the videos. They came because they'd heard the story. But they stayed because the food was good. And because when they ate one of my burgers, they felt something. They felt cared for. One evening, a woman in her 50s came up to the window. She ordered a burger and fries, and while I cooked, she watched me work. "You're the guy from the video, right?" she asked. "That's me," I said, flipping a patty. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Why do you do this? You could probably get a job at a real restaurant by now." I thought about it for a second, then smiled. "Because this isn't just food," I said. "This is my second chance. And I want everyone who eats here to feel like they're getting one too." She didn't say anything, but when I handed her the burger, she looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you." And I knew she wasn't just talking about the food. That night, I sat in my food truck after closing, counting the cash from the register. $640. In one day. I leaned back in the driver's seat and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving. I was building something. 6 months after I bought that beat-up food truck, I signed a lease on a real restaurant. It was a tiny place, barely 900 square feet, tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop on the east side of Nashville. The previous owner had run it into the ground, and the space had been sitting empty for 8 months. The floors were cracked. The kitchen equipment was ancient. The walls were stained with years of grease and neglect. But when I walked in and saw the big front windows facing the street, I could picture it. I could see people sitting at tables laughing, eating, feeling at home. The landlord wanted $3,000 up front, first month, last month, and a security deposit. I had $2,900 saved. I gave him everything I had and promised the rest by the end of the week. He looked at me like I was crazy. "You sure about this, kid?" "No," I said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." I spent 2 weeks transforming that place with my own hands. I scrubbed every surface. I repainted the walls a warm cream color. I built tables out of reclaimed wood I found behind a construction site. I hung Edison bulbs from the ceiling because I couldn't afford real light fixtures. I named it Cole's Table. The idea was simple. This was a table where everyone was welcome. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, black or white, broken or whole. If you walked through that door, you had a seat. Opening day was a Friday in July. I was terrified. I had no staff, no advertising budget, no safety net, just me, a small kitchen, and a handwritten menu on a chalkboard. I opened the doors at 11 a.m., and for the first hour, nobody came. I stood behind the counter watching people walk past, my heart sinking with every person who didn't stop. Then, at 12:15, a couple walked in. They were older, maybe in their 60s, dressed like they'd just come from church. "You open?" the man asked. "Yes, sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sit anywhere you'd like." They ordered burgers and fries. I cooked everything myself, hands shaking the whole time, praying I didn't mess it up. When I brought the food to their table, the woman took one bite and smiled. "Honey, this is delicious," she said. I could have cried right there. By 1 o'clock, the restaurant was half full. By 2, there was a wait. Word spread fast. People remembered me from the food truck. They brought their friends, their families, their co-workers. Within 2 weeks, we had lines out the door every night. I hired my first employee, a 19-year-old kid named Jamal who'd been laid off from a car wash. He had no restaurant experience, but he had heart. I taught him everything I knew, the same way that old man at Eddie's Corner Grill had shown me kindness when I needed it most. Then I hired 2 more people, then 5. I didn't look for resumes. I looked for people who'd been knocked down and were trying to get back up. Single mothers, ex-convicts trying to rebuild their lives, kids who'd dropped out of school and needed a second chance. I paid them more than minimum wage. I fed them before every shift. I treated them the way I wish I'd been treated at Miller's Grill. And they worked harder than anyone I'd ever seen. By the end of the first year, Cole's table was a neighborhood fixture. We weren't fancy. We didn't serve lobster or filet mignon. We served honest food made with respect, and people felt it. Local magazines started writing about us. Food bloggers came in and posted pictures. A Nashville lifestyle website called us the soul of the city in burger form. But the moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday night in October. I was in the kitchen plating an order when Jamal came back and said, "Hey chef, there's someone here asking for you." "Who is it?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron. "I don't know. Older guy. Looks kinda stressed." I walked out to the dining room, and my heart stopped. Standing near the entrance, looking around like he didn't know if he should stay or leave, was Mr. Davis, my old boss, the man who fired me. He looked different, older, tired. His clothes didn't fit quite right, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. For a moment, we just stared at each other. "Ethan," he said quietly. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him to leave. Part of me wanted to ask why he was here. Instead, I just nodded. "Mr. Davis." He glanced around the restaurant, at the full tables, the happy customers, the line of people still waiting outside. "I heard about this place," he said. "I didn't believe it was you until I saw your name on the sign." I stayed silent. He cleared his throat. "Miller's Grill closed 4 months ago. Corporate pulled out. I've been looking for work ever since." I felt a twist in my chest. Not satisfaction, not revenge. Just sadness. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. He looked down at his shoes. "I came here tonight because I needed to say something. What I did to you, it wasn't right. You were one of the best workers I ever had, and I threw you away because I was scared of losing my own job." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Ethan." The dining room seemed to go quiet, even though people were still talking and eating around us. I took a breath. "You want to sit down?" I asked. He looked up, surprised. "Yeah," he said. "If that's okay." I led him to a small table by the window. I brought him a menu, and then I went back to the kitchen and cooked his meal myself. A cheeseburger with grilled onions, crispy fries, and a side of coleslaw. When I brought it to his table, I set it down in front of him. "This one's on me," I said. He stared at the plate and then at me. "Thank you," he whispered. I nodded and walked back to the kitchen. Later that night, after he left, Jamal asked me, Was that really your old boss? Yeah, I said. And you fed him for free? Yeah. Jamal shook his head, smiling. Man, you're different. I thought about that for a second. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I just remember what it's like to be hungry. 2 years have passed since that night. Cole's Table isn't just a restaurant anymore. It's become something bigger than I ever imagined. We expanded into the space next door. Now we seat 80 people, and on weekends the wait is still over an hour. But nobody complains. They sit outside on benches I built myself, drinking sweet tea and talking like they've known each other for years. Because that's what this place does. It brings people together. We started a program 6 months ago called Second Plate. Every week, 10% of our profits go toward feeding people who can't afford a meal. Anyone can walk in, say they're part of Second Plate, and get a hot meal. No questions asked, no judgment, no shame. Because I remember what it felt like to be hungry. And I remember what it meant when someone fed me anyway. We've served over 2,000 free meals so far. I also started hiring differently. If someone walks in with a resume full of gaps, red flags, or rough patches, they go to the top of my list. I don't care if you've been to prison. I don't care if you dropped out of school. I don't care if you've been fired from every job you ever had. What I care about is this. Are you willing to show up and try? Because that's all I had when I started. And someone gave me a chance. Now I do the same. One of my line cooks, a guy named Marcus. Not the same Marcus who let me crash on his couch, but the name always makes me smile. Spent 6 years in prison for a mistake he made when he was 19. He applied to 47 jobs after he got out. Nobody would hire him. Until he walked into Cole's Table. Now he's my head chef. He runs the kitchen better than I ever could. And every night before service, he gathers the team and says the same thing. We are not just cooking food. We're giving people a reason to believe the world's not all bad. I couldn't have said it better myself. Last month, a reporter from the Nashville Tribune came in to do a story on us. She sat at the counter, watching the organized chaos of a Friday night dinner rush, and at the end of the night, she asked me the question everyone asks. What's the secret? Why does this place work when so many restaurants fail? I thought about it for a long time. I think it's because we remember where we came from, I finally said. Every person in this kitchen has been broken at some point, and when you've been broken, you learn how to handle things gently. You learn that people aren't just customers, they're humans who need to feel seen. She wrote that down, word for word. The article came out 2 weeks later with the headline, From Fired Waiter to Community Hero, the Ethan Cole story. I didn't think of myself as a hero. I still don't. I'm just a guy who got knocked down and decided to get back up. But the article changed things. We started getting calls from other cities, people asking if I'd help them open their own version of Cole's Table. People who'd been incarcerated, people who'd aged out of foster care, people who'd lost everything and wanted to rebuild. I didn't have all the answers, but I shared what I knew. And slowly, the idea started to spread. There's a Cole's Table in Memphis now. One in Atlanta. One in Louisville. Each one is independently owned, but we all share the same mission. Good food, second chances, and a table where everyone belongs. I never set out to build an empire. I just wanted to survive. But somewhere along the way, survival turned into purpose. A few weeks ago, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name written in shaky handwriting on the front. Inside was a single piece of notebook paper. It said, Ethan, you probably don't remember me. I came into your restaurant about a year ago. I was homeless, hungry, and ready to give up. Someone told me about Second Plate, so I walked in and asked for food. You didn't just give me a meal. You sat down and talked to me like I was a person. You asked my name. You asked my story. That night I decided not to kill myself. I got help. I got sober. And last month I got a job. I just wanted you to know. You saved my life. Thank you. I read that letter 3 times and then I sat down in my office and cried. Because that's what this is really about. It's not about the food. It's not about the money. It's not even about proving people wrong. It's about the moment when someone who's lost everything realizes they still matter. I keep that letter in my wallet. On the hard days, and there are still hard days, I pull it out and read it again. It reminds me why I'm here. People ask me all the time if I ever think about that day I got fired, if I'm angry, if I hold a grudge. The truth? I'm grateful. Because if I hadn't lost that job, I never would have found my purpose. I never would have learned that the bottom isn't the end. It's the foundation. I saw Mr. Davis one more time after that night he came into the restaurant. He sent me an email a few months later asking if I had any openings. He said he'd do anything, wash dishes, clean tables, whatever I needed. I didn't hire him. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I knew he needed to find his own path the same way I found mine. I did, however, send him a list of places that were hiring, and I wrote him a reference letter. Because holding on to anger doesn't build anything. It just keeps you stuck in the past. And I'm not interested in the past anymore. I'm building a future. Every night before I lock up, I walk through the empty restaurant and look at the tables. I think about all the people who sat there. People who laughed, cried, celebrated, mourned, and found comfort in a simple meal. And I think about that kid sitting on the floor of a freezing apartment, eating a ketchup sandwich, convinced his life was over. I wish I could go back and tell him, hold on, it's going to be okay. In fact, it's going to be better than okay. But I can't go back. All I can do is keep moving forward, keep cooking, keep showing up, keep giving people a seat at the table. Because the road to rise doesn't end when you make it. It ends when you turn around and help someone else climb.